The African National Congress faction called the Radical Economic Transformation has been at the forefront, supporting former President Jacob Zuma. The group is on a quest to have Zuma freed from prison and has driven a number of demonstrations and calls for his release. It follows the former president's imprisonment at Estcourt prison for contempt of court. Then, the Pietermaritzburg High Court is also expecting to hear Zuma's special plea to have State Advocate Billy Downer removed from the corruption trial on Monday. What do we make of this? Could we expect more protests in the name of Free Zuma? And what do we make of the events of the past week? Well, to answer some of those questions, Newzroom Afrika's politics editor Sbu Ngalwa joins us to give us a roundup of some of those expectations. Sbu, very good morning to you. Leaders of Free Jacob Zuma campaign say their efforts will not cease. They are adamant, they are determined to ensure that the former president is freed from his 15-month imprisonment, and they're saying that they will not rest until this is achieved. And we've seen the ripple effect of their narrative. It stoked a fire, bringing to the surface South Africa's socio-economic crisis.
That's correct, Mpo. Look, Mpo, to be honest with you, I really believe that it's just bluster on the part of that particular campaign. Because while the events of the past week exposed our weaknesses as a country, as you are saying, also raised to the surface those issues, underlying socio-economic issues that were bubbling under the surface. But I think the events of the past week have proven for all to see that the so-called Free Zuma campaign or artifaction in the ANC is not as strong as they thought they are, because in their minds, in all their planning, the intention was for South Africa to burn. And what we have seen is actually KwaZulu-Natal burning and parts of Gauteng, and that is telling. And it's also telling in terms of where you can concentrate this die-hard support for the former president. Because the fact that no one else reacted elsewhere, and there may have been attempts, and those failed, that shows you that there is no grassroots that is baying or for that is clamoring for the release of the former president. And even if you listen to all the people who were involved in the looting, obviously the instigators of these protests had an intention, which is to start a fire, and when that fire flares, then it can catch on and affect everyone else. Most of the people who participated in the looting, in all the interviews we were having, they kept talking about their economic situations, their poverty, their unemployment, and the fact that they saw others participate in the looting, and they also participated, not that they were there, because they were supporters of the former president. So it is important to locate that, to be clear about that. Look, I think whatever intention or whatever action that is planned by this particular grouping, whether it's tomorrow or not, I think it's more propaganda than anything. I do not expect that you're going to see hordes of people, thousands of people on the streets or marching to Luthuli House or to demand the release of the former president. I know for a fact that there is a march that is planned for KZN, which is meant to start from Umlazi at where the Mega City Mall was to the regional office of the ANC. I'm sure there will be a march there, but the reality here is that I think it is correct to say that the attempts of that very grouping have failed. They may have sabotaged parts of KwaZulu-Natal mostly, and that is correct because the former president does command a lot of respect and a lot of support in KwaZulu-Natal particularly. And that's why he was their trump card in the 2009 elections when they finally dislodged the IFP from the provincial government, where they were able to win 62% of the vote. But I think beyond anything, I think that campaign has lost steam.
You speak about instigators, and I suppose that's the direction we're going into as we go into the new week, because police, as I understand, according to some of the papers here, police say 3 of the 12 people supported or suspected of being instigators have since been arrested. And we heard State Security Minister Ayandas also speaking about some of the measures and the way forward, as well as President Cyril Ramaphosa admitting that, yes, they were caught on the back foot here. They had been poorly prepared, and saying that the past events were nothing less than a deliberate, coordinated and well-planned attack on the country's economy.
Now, the fact that you must understand, Mpo, that these protests or riots or acts of sabotage were not quelled by the police. It is actually, the turning point was actually South Africans saying it's not going to happen. It's either we're going to defend our streets or defend our malls. Now, those are not the right ways to quell such. You still expect law enforcement, which is why now we're sitting with a case of over 20 people dead in Phoenix, and no one can explain how they died. And also you have cases where people can just open fire. Of course, people are panicked, but the reality is that over the past week, we lost control completely. The state lost control completely. I mean, there was no police. There was no police minister until 3 or 4 days later. There was no Premier of KwaZulu-Natal until 3 or 4 days later. The mayor of eThekwini, the main city that is affected by these protests, writes on Facebook, "We are Msholozi, free Msholozi," which to anyone can say, he may argue that it's because he is a supporter of the former president, but within the context of looting happening in his city, that can easily be interpreted as a tacit support for the anarchy that played out in his city. So for him to come out 4 days later, suddenly calling for an end to the anarchy and counting the cost is actually disingenuous, and it's actually quite irresponsible for a politician in his position. So what this has exposed is that the state lost control completely. But now imagine this. Even with the situation where you had a state that had no control, you still were not able, this inferno did not reach other parts of the country because South Africans, in their own minds and of their own volition, decided broadly that they are not taking part in this. So that also is telling, one, about the weaknesses of the state, and secondly, about the flaws and the propaganda that has been driven by the so-called Free Jacob Zuma campaign. But thirdly, from a political point of view and within the context of the ANC, it has, if anything, weakened that grouping that identifies itself as RET, that has always claimed to have groundswell support. Think about it. Ace Magashule is the former premier of Free State and a strong man in the Free State. One would have imagined, if you listen to the rhetoric and the people who turn out in court, that at least the fire would have caught on in the Free State. Not that he's a supporter of the sabotage, but I'm just saying that that's something that would have happened. Andile Lungisa, the same thing would have happened in Port Elizabeth. Instead, he ended up being paraded around parts of Gqeberha, where he was calling for peace under duress, I understand. But the reality is that that campaign also failed there. That on its own exposes the weaknesses in this campaign. So I think those 3 points are important. And I think as we go forward, the most important thing here is that we hear of 3 suspects that have been arrested in this country. Suspects are supposed to be presented in court within 72 hours. It was last week where we heard that one instigator or so-called instigator had been arrested, but no such a person has appeared in court, and not in so far as we know. But I would imagine that for the government, especially because they are on the back foot, they have no reason to hide who they have arrested. So this government has also been poor on all fronts, including communication in this particular regard. And it may well be that they have no idea where the so-called instigators are.
Now, another matter that will be important will be the focus on the Pietermaritzburg High Court tomorrow, where former President Jacob Zuma's special plea is set to be heard, and his grievances and his gripe with advocate Billy Downer will be something that will be fleshed out. What are some of the expectations, especially as we also learn that his former President Jacob Zuma's legal team will be arguing in the Pietermaritzburg High Court to have their client physically present in the court?
Well, the reality is that, Paul, I think as you are saying, the main application that will be heard tomorrow, remember that the matter was postponed from last month, so that they can hear this application. So what this effectively means, and in layman's terms, is that while the Zuma trial was at its start, there was a new application that was brought by his legal team. So which means that the original trial is put aside for a moment while the Judge Kuhn hears this application. So within this trial, now they're going to have a mini trial of sorts where they're going to deal with the issue of whether Billy Downer should continue or stand down or recuse himself as the prosecutor of state. And given the fact that this has been the issues that the former president's lawyers are raising, I don't think there are reasonable grounds for Advocate Downer to recuse himself. It may well be that, as others have argued, it is perhaps another tactic to delay the resumption or the start of the trial, because the case law that has, I'm not a legal expert, but legal experts have told me, and they've told this channel, and they've told other journalists as well, that case law that has been that has set the precedent has shown that judges, in fact courts, do not frown upon prosecutors that are antagonistic, and they're saying that the nature of the courts and the role of a prosecutor is that there is nothing wrong with a prosecutor being biased. Because remember, when you go to prosecute, your argument there is that you go to argue that the person is guilty because you are convinced that they are guilty. So your biases are not on their own a reason enough why you should recuse yourself. It is judges that are supposed to be impartial in this regard. I think the lawyers of the former president will have a tall order trying to convince the court that Billy Downer is not a suitable prosecutor. And besides, you can never be prosecuted by a prosecutor that you like. It is not up to an accused person. But obviously, that will be an issue that will be debated. From what I understand, that the legal team of the Provo has prepared nothing less than 150 documents, 150 pages that will be presented to the court. So obviously that's what will be dealt with tomorrow. We know also that he will be appearing virtually in this, as much as his lawyers and his foundation are arguing that he should be there physically. We know that under level 4 of lockdown, we do not have, and we have not had physical hearings. And also it would be interesting what they argue. What are they arguing would be a reason. How will he be inconvenienced by appearing virtually as opposed to a physical hearing? Now, that would be an interesting one, and I look forward to hearing that as well, Mpo.